Hi everybody, Miss Riley here. Hope you're doing well. Today we're going to talk about American and Mexican art in the 1930s and 40s. So we're going to talk about the WPA, the Harlem Renaissance, and Mexican muralists. So a lot of the art that we're going to see artists who are documenting their lives, like everyday life and art. We'll examine the political content of art resulting from African American migration, along with themes of regionalism. We're going to talk about the WPA, and we're also going to think about and talk about how artists reflect their personal or collective experience of everyday life in their art. So first I'm going to show you this video from the Art Institute of Chicago's exhibition called America After the Fall, Paintings in the 1930s.
The 1930s is the most important decade of the 20th century. I say that in terms of both politics and aesthetics. The Great Depression changed everything for Americans. They lost their self-confidence. They were no longer the bright and shining city on the hill. They had a great fall from grace, and people were scared. There was much social protest. You had the rise of communist ideas and the rise of fascist ideas. Democracy wasn't working. We have to do something else. We have to change things. And artists showed those things. The regionalists, Thomas Hart Benton, John Stewart Curry, Grant Wood, all painted Midwestern scenes to revive the past and make that the American future. Well, that was impossible. After the 1920 census showed that we were no longer a nation of small farmers. We were an industrialized nation. More people lived in cities than lived in rural areas. Movies were a huge deal in the 1930s because they were cheap, and you could spend a quarter and go in and watch movies 24 hours a day, and Edward Hopper often did. New York Movie is a picture that I think captures the mood and the quality of realism versus what's unreal, of the Depression 30s beautifully. From social realism to regionalism to abstraction, all of these things were going on in the same time. And so we want our audience to see what was happening in the 1930s so they could understand the richness of thought in this decade.
As you listen to the band, don't you get a bubble? As you listen.
Okay, so moving on. Like she said, the Great Depression began with the stock market crash in 1929, and it was made worse by the 1930s Dust Bowl. President Roosevelt in 1935 created the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, and it put Americans back to work. So it was mostly an infrastructure program that employed around 8.5 million Americans to build roads, schools, sewers, hospitals, bridges, and they planted millions of trees. The WPA also employed thousands of actors, musicians, writers, and visual artists. And then, of course, once World War II was imminent, these jobs transitioned into armed services. They transitioned into the armed services and the defense industries. And that's when the WPA ended. So the unemployment rate in 1935 was at a staggering 20%. The WPA was designed to provide relief for the unemployed by providing jobs and income for millions of Americans. At its height in late 1938, more than 3.3 million Americans worked for the WPA. Interestingly enough, a few days ago, on April 16th of 2020, because of the coronavirus pause, the unemployment rate in the United States is now 18% and climbing. So we're almost to the time of the Great Depression. hopefully ours won't last as long as the Great Depression. But also, maybe we'll see something like the WPA come back to help our economy. I'm guessing it probably won't happen under Trump's leadership, but if there is a leadership change, maybe we'll see something like the WPA again. So part of the WPA was Federal Project Number One, and it was just known as Federal One. And this put artists back to work while entertaining and inspiring the larger population by creating a hopeful view of life amidst this economic turmoil. So artists created motivational posters and painted murals of American scenes in public buildings. Sculptors created monuments, and actors and musicians were paid to perform. Federal One also established more than 100 community art centers throughout the country. The WPA Arts Program led to later creation of the National Foundation for the Arts. And when FDR took office in 1933, he promised a new deal for everyone, and that included women, African Americans, and other groups. So the WPA put women to work as seamstresses and librarians and in clerical jobs, which now doesn't really sound like like a step back, but at the time it was a big deal. So artists created, like we said, these motivational posters. Here's a couple on this slide that you can see, and the top image is a mural study by Philip Guston called Early Mail Service and Construction of Railroads. And it's from 1938, and it's tempera on fiberboard. And it was later it actually turned into a mural for a post office in Georgia. I'm sure this image looks familiar to all of you. It's a very iconic image of the Great Depression, Dorothea Lange's photograph, Migrant Mother from 1936. And it just documented how people adjusted to the forces of nature and economic hardships. So like I said, the Great Dust Bowl happened in the 1930s. And Dorothea Lange took this photograph in 1936. She was employed by the U.S. government's Farm Security Administration program, the FSA, that was formed during the Great Depression to raise awareness of and provide aid to impoverished farmers. So this photograph was published in a newspaper, and it actually was a catalyst for change. Like, people didn't really know what was going on in the West, and this is just one image. This is like such an interesting story. I watched a documentary about Dorothea Lange. It was a really beautiful documentary, and it said that this woman, you can see she has 3 or 4 children. She's holding a baby, and there's 2 children that are hiding their faces. And although she was, I'm sure she had a lot of pride, she knew that it was important for Dorothea Lange to take this picture because she sort of she knew that it was going to lead to a positive change for her and her family. So also around this time, this painting's from 1942, but Edward Hopper, definitely an artist that I'm sure you've seen a lot of lately with our whole social isolation, right? Because he is the king of social isolation. So in 1933, Hopper received, he had a retrospective exhibition at the MoMA. So he was definitely already a celebrated artist, because he wasn't part of the WPA. He was a little bit older, so he was already a famous artist by the time the Great Depression happened. And you can see here, this is one of his most famous paintings, Nighthawks, of these people in a bar. The streets are very desolate, and we have this one person here sitting alone. These people don't even look like they're not even talking to each other as well. Um, so, he often chose locations that are vacant of human activity, and they also frequently imply this transitory nature of contemporary life. So there's like deserted gas stations, railroad tracks, and bridges, and the idea of travel is fraught with loneliness and mystery. And then other scenes are inhabited only by a single pensive figure, or maybe by a pair of figures who seem to not even communicate with each other. This is from 1939, New York movie. And then, he he did have commercial success, throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, but he found himself losing critical favor as the abstract expressionism movement came, obviously because he's not an abstract expressionist, which we're going to talk about in the next video. So I love this painting, Morning Sun from 1952. So, even during an era of national prosperity and cultural optimism, his art continued to suggest that the individual could still suffer a powerful sense of isolation in post-war America. This is from 1952. We all know this painting, right? Grant Wood's American Gothic from 1930. Look, all these paintings are in the Art Institute of Chicago. So definitely, if you have a chance to go to Chicago, it's such a great museum. So Midwestern regionalism was a reaction to modernist abstract painting and focused on American subjects. So, this is definitely an American iconic painting. This, oh my gosh, I'm sure that you're looking at this woman, you're like, wow, this woman looks like Miss Riley. Oh, I can't tell you how many people said that. It's so annoying. Even my own child is like, Mommy, that woman looks like you. Like, oh my God. Anyway, so this this painting that Grant Wood painted actually is a painting of his dentist and his sister. So actually, I don't know if that's Grant Wood's sister or the dentist's sister, to be honest with you. But they're from Iowa. And it's almost like, are they being mocked or do you relate to them? They're clearly hardworking Midwesterners. Do they look kind or do they look stern? Like, what is she even looking at? Grant Wood studied in Europe, and, he's creating this American version of this, this version of America. We can read a lot into this painting. We look at it, we're like, is this a father and daughter? Is it a husband and wife? I'm sure people put their own ideas on this. But we do have to remember that this is from 1930 and the stock market crashed the year before this. So, and the fascists are starting up in Europe. So is it, anti-international? Is it echoing European fascism and nationalism? Where the ideology that goes back to a rural or primitive experience. Here's some more Grant Wood. He's really known for these rolling landscapes that are really ideal or stylized. This is Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. I love how he has these like aerial views of these landscapes. And this painting on the left I really love too. It's so daunting with the telephone pole that looks like a cross, and then we have a hearse in the middle of the painting, and it almost looks like this winding road is going to hit this truck. The hearse and the truck are going to collide. Okay, and then we have Thomas Hart Benton, another regionalist painter, and this is a mural, as you can see with the doorway here. So this painting is part documentary and part invention. The images include positive and negative aspects of the state's history. This is in the state capitol in Jefferson City, Missouri. And his style is very distinct. Like, how would you describe his style? Think about how you could describe his style. This is, I put this one in here. This is a classroom at Indiana University. I went to Indiana University for my undergraduate studies, and Woodburn Hall is very popular. I had a class in here with these two paintings. So you can see Thomas Hart Benton's murals on the side of this classroom. It's called A Social History of Indiana from 1933. And it's actually a little controversial. So the title of it is Parks, the Circus, the Klan, and the Press. And so we see all of that imagery in this painting. Back here we do see the Ku Klux Klan with the burning cross, and we see a journalist here that's writing. So in 2017, this painting was at the heart of a controversy at IU, where a student petition was calling for this mural to be removed from the classroom, and to be removed because of the Ku Klux Klan that's in the background. So, but others, spoke up in support of the artwork, contending that Benton was looking to draw attention to the evils of the Klan. So, in this mural, the Klansmen are seen alongside of the reporter's in the foreground, a photographer, and a printer. So it's a reference to this Pulitzer Prize winning 1928 story that uncovered the KKK's ties to the government and broke their political influence over the state. So in a quote from the vice president for diversity at IU, he says, it does not glorify or celebrate this particular dark episode of the KKK in Indiana, but instead shows that the state's past has shameful moments, the likes of which we do not want to ever see again. So it's important to understand the state's history, the good and the bad. So it's still there. So in just transitioning from, the murals from America, I'm sure you're aware that the Mexican artists have a long history of mural painting as well. And they incorporate a lot of political statements into their artwork. So after the Mexican Revolution that ended around 1920, Mexico needed to educate the people to promote pride in the ideas of the revolution, resistance, and ancient cultures and cultural identity. So they also, with their murals, addressed themes like politics and oppression, progress, and a lot of other important issues at the time. This mural is a recreated version of the mural. If you saw the movie Frida, which hopefully you have, it's such a great movie. In the movie, Diego Rivera is painting this mural, Man, Controller of the Universe, in a building owned by Rockefeller, and he didn't agree with some of the politics that Diego Rivera was painting into it, and they had it removed. So this is a recreated version that is now in Mexico City. So this is Jose Clemente Orozco, another really famous Mexican muralist. You can see all of the imagery in here as well. So the Mexican muralists took the art outside of galleries and museums and brought it into public spaces, which essentially made the art accessible to all. So that was a really important aspect of mural painting. This is another Diego Rivera in the National Palace in Mexico City. It's a fresco. And then speaking of Mexico, just a little quick review of Frida Kahlo's The Two Fridas from 1939. She was clearly influenced by the Surrealists. You can see that this is a very surreal image. But she was also married to Diego Rivera, and he was one of her mentors. So, and she was surrounded by social realists. So here we see that she's really reflecting on her cultural identity with, on the left, we have, her in a traditional or a contemporary European wedding dress. And on the right, we have her in more of like a traditional Mexican outfit. So the two hearts that she has are connected by this vein, And so it's a double self-portrait. Okay, this is a Cuban painter, Wilfredo Lam. This is from 1943, gouache on paper, and it's mounted on canvas. It's called The Jungle, and he was really interested in Afro-Caribbean culture and Santeria. And, he was Cuban born, but he lived in Europe and in the United States. He had an interest in Hispanic and African mix of cultures. So here you can see some of that influence in the crescent-shaped faces that look like African masks and sculpture. There's very pronounced hands and feet, and it almost looks top-heavy, like they could just topple over at any minute. So he was a member of the Surrealist movement, and in this painting, he really wanted to communicate a psychic state. Also in this painting, he is addressing the history of slavery in colonial Cuba. So these figures are meant to suggest sugarcane, and sugarcane is a product of Cuba that people really break their backs to work in these sugarcane fields. They do not grow in jungles, even though this is titled a jungle. He's referencing how hard it would be to work these fields. So this painting, though, is very different than how foreigners perceived Cuba. Especially in the 30s and 40s, Cuba was seen as kind of like a playground, and this is just a poster. It's like a Visit Cuba, so near and yet so foreign, 90 miles from Key West. So Wilfredo Lam really wanted to take what he called the cha-cha-cha out of his artwork. So you can see that his painting is much different than this kind of traditional way that foreigners visited or portrayed Cuba. He was interested in Santeria, which is a religion that's developed from the beliefs and customs of the Yoruba people from Africa and incorporating some elements of Catholic religion. So it's obvious, again, this is just a very different painting than how a lot of foreigners perceived Cuba as a playground, because people would go to Cuba, as just like a weekend. It was, in some ways, it was kind of like Las Vegas. There were all these shows and clubs and music, and people didn't really see the other side of Cuba. That was, people were like killing themselves to work the sugarcane fields. This painting is at the MoMA, so if you haven't seen it, make sure you go see it. It's interesting to me. It's actually a really large painting. I don't see the measurements here, but I want to say it's at least 6 feet by 6 feet probably. And to know that it's done gouache on paper and then mounted on canvas, I just think that's pretty interesting. Okay, so moving on, we've been talking about murals and Diego Rivera. This is your number 143, Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in the Alameda Park by Diego Rivera from 1947-1948. It's a fresco. So we can also think about we're going to talk about, or I'm going to show you again, The School of Athens by Raphael, also a fresco with lots of important people. So think about that painting as we're looking at this one. So this painting, this mural, has hundreds of characters from 400 years of Mexican history. And they're all gathering for a stroll through Mexico City's largest park. So, but the colorful balloons that you see and these impeccably dressed visitors and the vendors with all their diverse wares cannot conceal the darker side of this dream. So we see a confrontation between an indigenous family and a police officer, and we see a lot of other things. So is this a dream? He's calling it a dream, but maybe in some parts it's kind of like a nightmare. So here we have, as you can see, a man shooting the face of another man who's being trampled by a horse in the midst of this conflict. So hopefully it's just a dream, and not reality. And then here in the foreground, we see Diego Rivera painted himself into this mural. Diego Rivera never officially joined the Surrealists, but he sort of uses this approach in this painting, because it's all of these unrelated historical people that are all coming together. So in the middle, we have this skeleton who is named La Catrina. Katrina was a nickname for an early 20th century upper class woman who is dressed in European clothing. And here, the La Catrina unites these two great Mexican artists in this mural. So she holds Rivera's hand. So this little guy here is Diego Rivera, which is funny because he was not a little man. And she holds the other hand here of Posada, who was a famous Mexican printmaker. And then also we see here Frida Kahlo and standing behind Diego Rivera. So this is, a double portrait, and she's holding a yin yang, however you would like to pronounce it. And this in this Chinese philosophy, it's refers to the opposite yet interdependent forces like day and night. So and also within this concept is also maybe thought of as the yin as female and the male and yang as the male. So this Chinese symbol becomes a metaphor for Rivera and Kahlo's complex relationship. Remember, he started off as her mentor, and then they became married, and then they divorced, and then they got married again. So, she was sick a lot, and she was also very small. And at the time, he's making himself smaller than her. So maybe in some ways he is referring to how helpless he felt at her being sick. So, I thought I added a picture. Oh, I do have it. Okay. All right, so this is the whole mural together. And so this is kind of interesting too. So Alameda Park is a park. This is the Alameda Park. They call it Alameda Central in the heart of Mexico City. And this is the park that Rivera is referencing in the painting. So it's an urban park downtown Mexico City. This park was created in 1592. And it's the oldest public park in the Americas, which I think is really amazing. So it's located near the Palacio de Bellas Artes, which is a prominent cultural center in Mexico City, which holds many famous murals that are painted inside. But if we look at this, do you notice something about this park? Like, what is the, obviously there's a lot of trees, but do you see this giant X here? They've made the walkways an X. So this aerial view, that also reminds me of this, the frontispiece of the Codex Mendoza, which was created by the the Viceroy of New Spain. And remember that this was, not for you to remember, but this is interesting. So this was made in 1541, and this was created only 50 years before that park was created. So you can kind of see the influence of this X that is representing the canals that were once in the very, very early Mexico City. So remember that that the original city, Tenochtitlan, I'm sorry, I can never pronounce that correctly. It was established in the middle of Lake Texcoco in the Valley of Mexico in 1325. And most of that former Aztec capital is below modern day Mexico City. This Codex Mendoza frontispiece was, it took all of the, it was a way to teach the people I'm sorry, the king of Spain about the Aztec culture. So inside of this inside of this book, there are many little diagrams about the Aztec culture. So this city, though, the reason why you can see it's divided into four parts, and there's this intersecting blue-green undulating diagonals because the city was made of canals, sort of similar to Venice, and it was divided into these four quarters, which were believed to represent the four cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. So, yeah. Okay. So, if we step away from the center and you read this mural like a text, we see that there's this chronology that emerges. On the left side of the composition, it highlights the conquest and colonization of Mexico over here, and the fight for independence and the revolution occupy the majority of the central space in here, and the modern achievements fill the right on this side. For some historians, the central area in here is a snapshot of bourgeoisie life in 1895, and you can see these like really refined ladies and gentlemen in their Sunday best under the watchful eye. If you could see this guy here, that is Porfirio Diaz, and it's almost like he's looking over them, right? So you know, one can get the sense of inequality that stirred average average Mexicans to overthrow their dictator and initiate the Mexican Revolution, which lasted from approximately 1910 to 1920. And like I said, we're going to compare it to this painting, your number 76, The School of Athens, by Raphael from 1509 to 1511. Do you remember where this painting is? Yes, you're right. It's in the Vatican, in the papal apartments, where I think this is in the study of the papal apartments, like in the library. It's a very large mural, and you can compare it to Diego Rivera's mural to the School of Athens. How would you compare it? Why don't you pause for a second and think about how you could compare this mural to Diego Rivera's Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Park. Well, for one, it's a large mural, right? It's also addressing the ideas important to the time. So here we have Renaissance ideas, and you know, and the other addresses Mexican history and the Revolution. And it's also featuring many, many inspirational individuals. It's like a who's who of the time. So in this painting, you know, we have like all kinds of artists and philosophers and mathematicians. And this is just a few that they've labeled here. Almost all of these people represent individual people. Just on a fun note, we also have the Beatles album cover, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club's Band. And here too, we have like a whole collage of all these like really, you know, famous, important people. So this is, this is for the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club's Band. We're not going to get into that. Here I put this image of Diego Rivera working on this painting. So, you know, more often than not, history is written by the victor, right? And it reflects this incomplete story. And Diego Rivera was really all about the common people, and he really wanted to create an antidote to this idea that, you know, we only see this one side of history. So that's why here, you know, we see stories of the indigenous people and the masses, and it also, you know, the artist reminds the viewer that the struggles and glory of 4 centuries of Mexican history are due to the participation of Mexicans from all different walks of society. And this side, this is the left side. So, you know, this is more of the past. So we see here it's represented by this oversized figure of Benito Juarez here. He restored the republic after French occupation and attempted to modernize the country as president. And then over here, I think it's this guy. This is Hernan Cortez, the Spanish conqueror who initiated the fall of the Aztec Empire. And then here, remember her? Oh, I should have her portrait. I should have her portrait here. Well, I'm not going to add it now. Anyway, Sor Juana, as we know, the 17th century nun and one of Mexico's most notable writers. And who else in here? Who else? Oh, there's so many people. I forget. Okay. Here on this side, we have the modern achievements. Phil the Right, but there's also, this is like the police officer that's also getting in some sort of conflict with these people. Okay, so like we said, this is the central area, which we've already talked about. Okay, so moving on, what's happening in the United States cities and in New York City specifically? So in general, the Great Migration is happening. This is all happening simultaneously, right? Mexican Revolution and all these mural paintings, and fascism is starting up in Europe, and at the same time in America we have the Great Migration. So from 1910 to 1930, and then again from 1930 to 1970, 6 million African Americans out of the rural South move to the Northeast, Midwest, and the West. So they moved to major cities: New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Indianapolis. And it was the largest internal movement of an American population. And by the end of the Great Migration, African Americans became an urbanized rather than rural population. Northern American cities became significantly more Black. So, for the most part, the conditions in the South were hard, and they, in the North, there were jobs in cities. Actually, I'm not going to go that much into it because I'm going to show you an artwork that covers all of it. And so at the same time, why was the Harlem Renaissance happening? I mean, we know the word Renaissance to be rebirth. So, there was a rebirth in Harlem, and it was amazing. So during, oh, sorry, I thought I'd turn that off. Let me do that now, sorry. Okay. So, all right. So during the Great Migration, the majority of African Americans who moved north ended up in New York City. Of the almost 750,000 African Americans who moved north, nearly 175,000 moved to Harlem. So the neighborhood of Harlem became an ethnic enclave of African Americans. And it's only 3 square miles, which I think is also really amazing. So it became the largest concentration of Black people in the world. Of course, now with gentrification, I don't know if that's still true. Maybe it is. Okay, so like we said, the Harlem Renaissance was a movement of African American culture and literature, dance, music, and art during the 20s and 30s. And like we said, it resulted from the Great Migration following the First World War, in which many African Americans moved to northern urban cities. And its influence lasted well into the later 20th century. And some common themes were civil rights, racial pride, and the influence of slavery on modern culture. So the artist we're going to talk about is Jacob Lawrence. Here's his self-portrait that he painted from 1977, but this is a painting or a photograph of him. He was born in 1917 in Atlantic City, New Jersey. He was the son of Southern migrants, and he moved with his mother and sister to Harlem in 1930 at the age of 13. And in 1938, Lawrence had his first solo exhibition at the Harlem YMCA, and he started working for the WPA, which we were talking about earlier, He started working for the Federal Art Project. And in 1940, at the age of 23 years old, he received a grant from the Rosenwald Foundation to create a 60-panel epic, The Migration of the Negro, now known as the Migration Series, which we're going to look at. I just threw this one in here because this is one of my favorite Jacob Lawrence. Jacob Lawrence is one of my favorite artists. I mean, he's like in the top 3 for sure, and this is one of my favorite paintings by him. I just love like his really bright colors and his simplified figures and the patterns that he uses, and everything's on an angle. And I also just like love the subject matter that he chooses a lot of like everyday life or like the collective experience, and that's what we're going to look at. So this is one image from the Great Migration from his series. It's a 60-panel series, and it depicts the migration of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North after World War I. And this is such a great series. So it was, so there's 60 panels, and 30 of them are in Washington, D.C., and the other 30 are in New York City. I think they're currently at the MoMA. I've seen them at the MoMA and the Whitney. To be honest with you, I don't know who owns it. I think it's actually the MoMA, and maybe when I saw it at the Whitney, it was on loan. I don't know. The other group is at the Phillips Museum in Washington, D.C., which is amazing. So this is the Phillips collection. Oops, sorry. I really want to show you guys this. And I'm sorry, this is going to be such a long video because I'm going to read this to you. You guys, I love it so much. Okay. If you hate me, feel free to skip ahead. But I really want to show this to you. Okay, wait. I want to show you the whole thing. Oh, I tried to set it up beforehand. It didn't work. Okay. Okay, how do I move this? Oh, I guess I gotta move it up. Okay. This is panel 1. I need to make it smaller. I should probably pause so that I don't bore you guys with this bad tech. I know you're not surprised that I have bad tech. Okay. So I'm going to show you these. Hopefully, I don't know if I can. Okay, anyway. So each one of these artworks it's like almost like reading a children's book, right? So the text that goes with this is during World War I, there was a great migration north by Southern African Americans. Okay, I am going to pause and figure it out just because I don't want to bore you. Okay, the second panel. The war had caused a labor shortage in northern industry. Citizens of foreign countries were returning to their native lands. From every southern town, migrants left by the hundreds to travel north. I'm sorry, it doesn't fit in the frame. All other sources of labor having been exhausted, the migrants were the last resource. Migrants were advanced passage on the railroads paid for by northern industry. Northern industry was to be repaid by the migrants out of their future wages. Sorry, I skipped one. Migrants whose life had been... Guys, I'm sorry. I'm not going to read this to you. I know you're really upset about it. Oh my God, it's not working. Okay, anyway, you should go to this website and see the whole thing. It's so beautiful. Maybe I could skip ahead just to show you like my favorite panels. Okay, let's see here. Okay, it's not working. Tech problems. Dashel, where are you? Okay. Anyway, you can see that there are all these. Oh, I could have read it that way. Oh, well. It's too late now. I'm not going to do it. All right, forget it. Okay. Anyway, you should see all the panels, but this is the one that you really need to know. This is the one for your 250. It's your number 141, and it's in the series. It's panel number 49, so it comes later in the series. And it's a casein tempera on hardboard. And this is a scene from a public restaurant in the north. So as you can see, the people are segregated by this yellow pole, that are split down the center. And this is really a narrative, right? This is telling the story about a public restaurant and what it was like to be a person of color in the North. And a narrative was really different because the time period, in the 40s, art was becoming increasingly abstract. So, I mean, obviously these shapes are simplified to the point where they are abstract, but it's not like abstract expressionism, which is what we're going to see next. But we do see these really flat, simple shapes. They're sort of hovering in this large space, this flat gray space. But he is sort of creating depth by placement, by putting by placing, the different tables and people higher or lower on the picture plane. I really love Jacob Lawrence's compositions because, as you can see, there's the picture plane is the images are going off of the picture plane, so it gives us the idea that there's even more space. So, this image underscores the fact that migrants had not left discrimination behind. It was just a different kind of discrimination. So, how would you say he unifies this series? I mean, you looked at some of the images that we saw earlier. I would say that he does it a lot with color. He does it with these simplified shapes. The form, he definitely does it. He definitely unifies the series formally by, creating these simplified shapes and the flat colors, and so it's clearly like all together. So he's also, he's not just telling a personal story, he is telling the collective African American experience. And also, he's using tempera paint, which he was probably, influenced by Italian masters of the 14th and 15th centuries. So the text that goes with this number 49 panel says they found discrimination in the North. It was a different kind. So, think about how it would be different. It was, in the South, they were treated very poorly, but it was probably more direct, whereas in the North, they were still discriminated against, but it was not as direct. So segregation was, seriously awful. Okay, so if we look at some of these shapes, just looking at them as a whole, you can see that it's united by color. Each of the paintings has like a very strong, like in this painting, you can see how the black unify. To me, it draws our eye around the whole image. Same thing with all of these, the colors that are pulled through the whole composition. Look at here, he's using complementary colors. Here he's using complementary colors. Here again, there's also very little individuality in the figures. They're so simplified. He's really telling us the collective African American experience, and it's highlighted because there's very little individuality in these figures. This is one of my favorite panels in the series. The text that goes with it just says they were very poor. And you can see here, in some ways it almost feels a little bit like an Edward Hopper painting too, right? Because they seem a little bit isolated from each other even. Okay, and then this painting is a pretty famous painting from the series. the text that goes with it says one of the most violent race riots occurred in East St. Louis. And here it's like you almost don't even know which body parts go to which shapes, you know. But all of these diagonals create a lot of energy, they create a lot of movement. He also is like oversized hands here, oversized hands. And just the way that the people are on an angle is really creating, it's very unique. It's creating a lot of visual interest. Okay, so before I give you your question, I just want to say, I used a lot of different sources to make this presentation. Thank you to everybody who lent me your material. And this is your question that I'd like you to answer in your Google Classroom, on our Google Classroom page. So there is a assignment there. So here I'd like you to look at the painting we've just been looking at, identify the artist who created this artwork, and the historical context of the work. Using visual and contextual evidence, discuss how the formal elements of the work convey the artist's perspective on the historical period depicted in the work. So feel free to pause, answer your question. All right, you guys, I miss you. Can't wait to read what you have to write, and I hope to see your faces soon in a video chat. Okay, take care. Bye.